So, as you already have heard, that I'm a feminist urban geographer, and I take a feminist and decolonial perspective on gendered violence, women's resilience, and resistive practices. And this was part of my PhD. And I also work on urban security governance policies and provisions, and which was my postdoc in Nepal. So I focus on South Asian cities. And today I'll be talking about resilience from the perspective of a kind of a from the below, like how do women and other urban dwellers practice resilience, and what does that mean for sustainable development and community resilience in the context of South Asian cities. So I also use an intersectional framework. It's a framework that has been devised by feminist geographers, more or less, and it is a framework that was coined. Intersectional word was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. So I engage with this framework, and I engage with identities of gender, class, race, ethnicity, age, and migration. And ethnographic field methods are at the core of my research as well as teaching. So I use interviews, I use mobile methods such as walking with my participants and taking go-alongs and asking them to do kind of WhatsApp diaries, as well as I do audiovisual methods of research. And I always focus on longitudinal research, which means that instead of going into one particular place and do a case study, I I tend to spend a longer period of time in one society or one kind of case study. So I spent about 1.5 years at the first run for my PhD in the field, and then I kind of followed it up over the 4 years of my PhD with 2-3 weeks of field work throughout the PhD. And for my postdoc, I was based in Nepal for 2 years. So, I mean, every day was kind of a field work oriented living in the field itself. So, in today's presentation, I will then focus on issues of gender violence and try to talk about what it means to do gender research on gender violence and how issues of resilience comes up in this kind of work. And I have analyzed this work using geographies of difference as a key tool or approach to analyzing the data, and sustainable development and justice, and how these two key topics of this refresher course kind of link back to gender development, gender difference, violence, and resilience. So what do I mean by these terms? So I first thought that I will go through some of the concepts first so that it makes more sense when I talk about them, pick them up during the presentation around my own research. So difference is, it's Iris Marion Young, 1990, she wrote about difference first, and her work has been foundational for feminist work, and it has been taken up, kind of modified and redeveloped. But I think the first entry point to difference is that it is a collective of persons differentiated from at least one other group by cultural forms, practices, or way of life. So it is about variation and heterogeneity in the society. So we have different groups, say gender, class, migrants, non-migrants, but so it means heterogeneity, but it never means otherness or exclusive opposition. So when someone talks about being a woman, it's not in opposition to, say, men or transgender people. So it's always women are being different or men being different than women and transgender people. So it is relational. So it's always in relation to some other group or some other kind of identity. So it is not fixed, or it is also not a priori, right? I mean, it's not something that is out there and you go and find it, but it's a process of identifying ourselves as a particular collective. So that can happen on the basis of our identities, on the basis of our biological differences, say skin color, sex, etc. Or it can also happen on the basis of our other identities, like, say, as teachers in universities. So that can become a collective, which is different from people who are non-teachers, but not in a university system. So it is quite fluid in that sense, and it is in a constant motion of making, unmaking, and remaking. So that it is a idea that difference is socially constructed. So there is a politics to that as well. And I'll come back to that with the concept of intersectionality. So when we talk about difference, it has to be in a plural term. So there's never a single story of a single story of difference. And this is where Kimberly Cranshaw's idea of intersectionality becomes very, very important, because she talks about how different identities or different kinds of differences intersect with each other in order for to produce a particular kind of experience in the city or in the society. So, for instance, for a woman, um, it is not just her identity, gender identity, but her identity of class, or maybe her education level, her place of origin, her migration status. All of that come together in producing a particular experience, as well as the ways in which she performs resilience in her everyday life. So we need to, when we talk about resilience and when we talk about sustainability, we'll have to be cognizant of these plural and relational terms, because it affects how we perform resilience and how we produce sustainability in society. So the term resilience, I'm sure you have heard I mean, it has been repeated through the last 6 days. But for me, when I do my work on resilience, Cindy Katz's work becomes very important. So Cindy Katz, she's a professor at the moment at the City University in New York. And she first came up with this framework, which is popularly known as 3 Rs. And she used that to analyze counter topographies of neoliberal reforms and their impact on children's lives in Hoa. It is a village in Sudan, and Harlem, it's a neighborhood in New York City, USA. So by using the counter topographies, Syndicate argued that, most of the time we think of places as unique or kind of standalone, like, as if the village in Sudan and a neighborhood in New York cannot be compared, right? But she argued that if we look at the process, if we look at neoliberalism as a process, then there is a political and as well as material, kind of politics and interest in comparing how people's life, in her case, children's lives, evolved around these neoliberal reforms that were happening at that time in 2004. So in the 3 Rs framework, she has three words or three conceptual frames, and which I think is very important in understanding, because resilience understood as a single concept often fails us as social scientists. So she uses 3 words as continuum. These are resilience, reworking, and resistance. And for her, resilience is just the beginning of the things. And then somebody has to rework, especially political relationships. And sometimes there are resistances that emerge in societies against particular forms of power relations and reforms and systems, etc., etc. So resilient practices are, according to Syndicate, are small acts. Okay, they enable material and spiritual survival, and they also help us recuperation of dignity. Okay, and it happens in a range of small transactions when overt resistance is not always possible. So this is where the role of resilience comes in. Why do we become resilient? Is because we cannot resist something. We cannot fight back in a very open and politically strong way. In that time, we use these kind of small activities or small kind of, it's like tactics and strategies in order to survive on a daily basis. And sustainable development, I mean, you have heard Samita ma'am talked about it beautifully in the context of education, that it is just that. It's about how do we develop today in order, without compromising our futures or the ability of the future generation to meet their own needs. So it's a very old definition. 1987 is still relevant. It still hasn't kind of sunk in most of our debates around what sustainable development is. And I think it's quite worthwhile to keep repeating this idea that it's not just about today, it's about the future. So I will later on explain how this resilience and sustainable development comes together in thinking through community resilience later on. So sustainable development, for it to kind of become fruitful, we need 3 levels of action. One is global action, local action, and people becomes very important part of these actions. And gender equality, which is where my research interests lie, in goal 5 on ending violence against women and girls is one of the spotlight initiatives. So you will see a lot of things happening around goal 5, and even Indian government and non-government organizations are taking up this kind of fight to end violence against women. But the issue of gender equality is weaved through across the 17 goals of sustainable development. And Samita ma'am talked about it in like some 10, 15 minutes ago, how gender equality within education is an important subject. So now coming to my own work, excuse me, I'm just having a little bit of water. So I work on gendered violence, especially so this part I'm basing on my PhD thesis, which was submitted in 2019. And the title of the thesis was Reconstructing Gender and Space, Single Women's Access to and Experiences of Public Space in Metropolitan City of Delhi, India. So I didn't look at the peripheries of Delhi. I looked at the kind of central parts of Delhi, and I focused on middle class, young, unmarried women within the age group of 25 to 35. And I was led by one question. Actually, main question was, how do women experience excuse me, use, occupy, and potentially transform public spaces in Delhi? So, through my research, I found that this particular question was answered through three main aspects. So, the first was experiences of violence and fear. Every woman I spoke to, I interviewed about 65 women, in-depth interviews of 1 hour to 2 hours, somewhere between that. And every woman talked about violence and fear being the main reason why they live in the city the way they live. But at the same time, they also talked about their resilience, and a lot of the women were working towards changing some of that violence and the context of fear in their individual ways. So, for example, some women were talking about how they are involved with certain NGOs, how they are doing field work, or they are engaging with issues of violence through their research and teaching. And there were collective forms of resistance against ingrained structural forms of violence that were perpetuated by urban institutions. So these kind of three stories became a triad in my in kind of shaping my thesis and shaping the ways in which I understand gendered life in the city. So, geographies of gendered violence is a multiscalar, multispatial, plural, and relational analysis of violence. So, I focused on three types of violence, and for the benefit of clarity and conceptual clarity as well as analytical clarity, I divided them into three types. Although these three types were highly interlinked, and sometimes it was difficult to say which one is what. So, anyway, I divided them into direct interpersonal violence and discursive violence and structural violence. And all three, when I took them to were taken together, they exposed how gendered violence is experienced through multiple relationships that women have had with, say, with their families, with their communities, public officials, strangers on the street, different kinds of spaces, and different kinds of temporalities, which is like time frames within the city. So direct interpersonal violence is it's a kind of violence where there is an identified offender and there is an identified perpetrator. So somebody snatching your bag away from you is an example of direct interpersonal violence. And they included physical harassments, sexual intimidation and sexual harassments, as well as symbolic threats to women's sense of integrity. So somebody kind of calling you by some bad name, or that would be classified as symbolic threats. And these kind of violence happened in spaces of micropublics. Micropublics is a concept that Ash Amin used to define the spaces which are kind of in between you, like the bus stop. It isn't a public space, kind of gives you a small kind of a relief because there's a shade and there are other people waiting for the bus, but it's not really the street. right? So it's kind of those kind of spaces. So bus stops, metro stations, metro trains, buses. So those kind of spaces become micropublics where encounters with strangers and with the city kind of unfolded. And these violences happened every day in women's life. So, and because they were happening in everyday kind of spaces and every day, so the participants in the project found it very difficult to predict where and when they were going to experience this kind of violence again.